However, what has become established in civilized societies are legal systems of states that have installed them for regulatory reasons and that react to a violation of their norms with power and violence as soon as they can prove any offense according to their own legal logic. The practical advantages of a higher principle of legal order are obvious. The only question is whether the justice claimed is not much more fraudulent because it remains a matter of appearances and mere entitlement. So that slavery continues to be practiced despite the premise that all people are born equal. The defenders of the old order are bringing out the big guns to defame criticism of a universalistic logic. Alan Finkielkraut considers postmodern views to be a fundamental evil of our time, which results in the defeat of thinking simply because a universalistic logic is fundamentally rejected. Although Lyotard denies his opponent's accusations of irrationalism, he actually has no good reason for it. A state beyond language, which he describes as the unrepresentable, is simply irrational. At least as long as there is still talk of rationality and no one who argues and wants to justify renounces all rationality. But that doesn't mean that irrationality can't also be rational. If the comparison to a universal logic becomes invalid because nothing exists in itself, and every object can only ever be seen in relation to a specific prerequisite, then something can be represented if a representation fulfills a specific purpose. Seen in this way, all subjectivism is irrational because it is not logically universally valid, but that does not mean that subjective arbitrariness cannot also be reasonable. Nothing is inherently backward, confused, primitive or underdeveloped. Everyone is free to have their own opinion about the meaning of these terms. There is no obscurantism that necessarily needs to be brought to light, but one can also think that something is nonsense if one believes that someone is contradicting themselves. That's why I don't have to force anyone to behave without contradiction. There is no reasonable reason for the priority of logical universality over the principle of subjective recognition. But that does not mean that stringent consistency in thinking is not a requirement of rational communication. And besides, there is no obligation to communicate constantly. Especially if someone too often no longer wants to know what he or she said 5 minutes ago. Logical incommensurability is, so to speak, the ultimate justification. The end of the flagpole of all objectivist cognitive endeavors. If there really is something to the story that the better argument prevails in the end, then incommensurability is the touchstone for it. All logic, all rationality and reason, all truth, all knowledge and recognition depends on the comparability of things. Such comparability is not so easily given. It requires someone's judgment and requires a common standard that serves as a criterion for comparison. Money is the typical common measure by which things are made economically comparable. It is a shared value that allows two negotiating partners to barter by considering the price of an offer acceptable for various reasons. Word and thing are, logically, not comparable because there is no common level for both. A word is, basically, different than an object or thing. There is a need for mediation through which the total difference can be transformed into comparability. This differentiation between word and thing, between sign and signified, only became a philosophical topic in the 19th century through a closer study of language, apart from the nominalists' criticism of general concepts. Rationalists, realists and empiricists were or still are of the opinion that there is no need for such mediation because the name of a thing can be justified by the thing itself through a direct experience of the thing. Even with Kant, a priori, i.e. pre-existing categories and fixed concepts serve to unite word and thing in a synthesis. Kant sees no problem in the application of the categories. Hegel, on the other hand, asks himself how it can be avoided that any categories are applied to any things arbitrarily and unnecessarily. In doing so, he illustrates a fundamental problem of knowledge, which consists in the incommensurability between word and thing, which Hegel believes he can overcome, dialectically. With Lyotard, the question of the unrepresentable becomes the only one that will be worth the effort of thinking and living in the coming century, i.e. ours. It cannot be said more clearly how important this matter is to him. Lyotard is not the first to discuss fundamental incommensurability. As the unspeakable, it was already the subject of the Ten Commandments in the so-called ban on images in paragraph 1. You shall not make for yourself any image of me your God, and so on. It was also an issue among mystics and nominalistic language critics. Even mathematicians have a concept of incommensurability. Lyotard wants to reinstate the incommensurable into its own right, as if such a right had ever existed. It is also unfortunate that he speaks of an incommensurable in itself, and thus refers to the modern idea of a universal truth. He assumes an common intellect to all people, that can and must understand the fundamental incomparability of words and things as knowledge. So it's not really clear who Lyotard means when he calls for philosophy to focus on the unrepresentable. Apparently for him there is something like the philosophy. Although in postmodern times it is repeatedly pointed out that the truth, the knowledge, the person in general, etc. do not exist. When Lyotard calls for finding the differend, his call is based on his insight that word and thing are not on the same logical level and therefore cannot be, logically, inferred from one to the other. For Lyotard, this triggers something like an initial spark for thinking. For Lyotard, thinking in general is the thinking of something that cannot be represented. This corresponds entirely to Adorno's view, for whom philosophy has its true interest in the conceptless, the individual. For Lyotard, the mere reference to the unrepresentable is sufficient, because it cannot be represented and therefore cannot be thought. The brainlessness of positivism has led to a weakening of general theory and, on the other hand, it is important to keep alive the experience of the unstructured, which in turn happens by bearing witness to the differend, in an Old Testament way, so to speak. The differend should be resolved and not ignored. The philosopher should stand up for differences as a guardian of incommensurability. There is a special ability to be developed, namely that of enduring the incommensurable. Lyotard wants to strengthen people's ability to suffer so that they can better cope with the loss of conceited harmony. What Buddhists and Hindus and other fate-believing factions should very well fit into their concept. But there is no reason for such pessimism. Lyotard is certainly right in his assertion that there is no logically legitimate transition from sentences of scientific description to sentences of ethical normative prescription. But this is only true in relation to an objectivist logic. There is no logical transition. Logically, there is no transition at all from whatever to whatever, because things, as incomparable individuals, inherently have no commonality with anything. Strictly speaking, there are not even individual things. Because the individual also requires a judgment in which distinctions are made. There are also no attributes that are inherent in a thing itself. All commonalities, similarities, analogies, differences must first be created, and they are created because someone has an interest with them or pursues a purpose. Lyotard does not distinguish between logical justification and ethical legitimacy. From an ethical point of view, it can be legitimate to combine different things under a common standard. But in jurisprudence, this is a daily business. How norms gain legal or ethical legitimacy is another question that cannot be fully addressed here. I will also only briefly mention here that Lyotard's attempts at legitimization are inadequate. They arise from his absolutization of incommensurability. Lyotard says that a differend occurs when a conflict cannot be resolved because a rule of judgment is missing. However, this rule of judgment is only missing in a purely rational logical respect, not in relation to recognized ethical norms. A community that is not held together by violence can hardly avoid giving itself some rules and norms. Lyotard also says that in concepts such as individual, reality, expediency, the differend is only concealed. This is also quite true for a subject in general or a reality in general, but not for the incomparable individual and his individual reality. Once the absolutism of things in themselves is abolished, each individual subject can, at his own discretion, describe something as real or purposeful, because he decides for himself what is useful to him, what is important or meaningful to him, and what is not. An all-round differend that does not allow any comparison, even if such a thing makes practical sense, overshoots the mark and turns itself into a terror that is only made worse by declaring it the most important task of the 21st century. Lyotard's conflict cases are necessarily decided unfairly because, despite claims to the contrary, he himself takes undifferentiated generality as a standard and does not distinguish between logical and ethical generalizability. If it's about two subjects who don't agree, then neither of them is right in a logical sense, and that's true for all eternity. Both have the same right or no right, if you will. And if naked force, as the saying goes, is not to decide in the event of a conflict, then for purely practical reasons a third instance is required, which acts as a norm and provides the criteria for the decision. But Lyotard does not accept such a norm as a higher authority at all. He criticizes Habermas for wanting to build a bridge between different, incommensurate discourses such as science, politics and ethics. But this is only impossible because all of these areas are committed to a common logic. Logically, science, ethics and politics are incommensurable with one another. But not if both science and politics are viewed as norm-giving authorities and thus as part of ethics. A common order can only be legitimized ethically, unless one rejects any order at all. But that is probably out of the question. If it's not about logic, but about interests, then these interests are quite comparable from an ethical point of view and can be assessed and condemned. In principle, this idea was already present in modern times, but it was very contradictory because in many respects it was believed that we were dealing with interestless, purposeless facts that were immune to any ethical objection. Through Lyotard's elimination of the subject, the miraculous event occurs in the differend, page 33f. That the differend, itself, demands to be posited, and this desire is also immanent in the differend, in itself, and that is not enough. This desire also suffers still under the injustice of not being seated immediately. This gives Lyotard's demand for difference, for the differend, for incommensurability, a completely different face. It is no longer about protecting a concrete living individual subject from the attacks of an arbitrary generality, but rather about bringing into being another objectivist bugbear called differend, which is declared to be something that is, as a thing in itself, marginalized, oppressed, repressed, and not understood as a fact. You are dealing with the same ideological nonsense that made the Enlightenment eat up its children. A higher reason that is independent of the subject and to which everyone must submit is once again postulated. It doesn't matter whether anyone is actually able to understand the logical basis of incomparability. Lyotard's incommensurability exists even when no one understands what it is supposed to be. The fundamental, logical, incompatibility of individuals is no secret to myself, but that is why I will not demand that everyone else be able or willing to understand it in the same way. Just as you can't expect everyone to do a doctorate in astrophysics. It is therefore not enough to establish that the mediation between word and matter cannot be successful. One must also make it clear that this can only be referred to as a purely logical mediation. This is impossible, but not any kind of mediation at all.